So welcome to the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. For those of you who were here with us yesterday, welcome again. For those of you who have had a chance to see the exhibition, I hope you enjoyed it. And if not, I hope you will tomorrow or in the following week. But of course, we have a special treat for you, because we have among us the co-curators of this wonderful show and this project, which has been very special and close to our heart, something we've been working on for many years now. So we would just like to acknowledge our proud partners very briefly before we can, of course, begin the panel. So, of course, the project is called Ancient World Project. And under the banner, the first presentation is what you see in the rotunda of the museum. It's called Ancient Sculptures, India, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome. For those of you who have had a chance to experience it, you'll know why exactly the exhibition is called so. The project has been a unique endeavor. It's educational in nature, it's heartfelt, it's earnest. But above all, we're thankful to the people who put it together. The exhibition is in association with the National Museum, New Delhi, the British Museum, London, the Staatliche Museen, Berlin, forgive my pronunciation, the J. Paul Getty Museum, LA, the Bihar Museum in Patna, the Directorate of Archaeology, Archives and Museums, Government of Madhya Pradesh, and it's jointly curated by the CSMVS, the British Museum, the Berlin State Museums, and the J. Paul Getty Museum. Primary support to the exhibition has been provided by Getty, who have been so generous with not just sharing their collections. There are the prettiest vases in the exhibition that you will see, but they've also shared knowledge. They've also shared support. So we thank them for that, for the wonderful partnership they've extended to us. Additional support to the project is by City India, who fund, support and encourage two of our major projects, the Museum on Wheels, the charming little bus you see behind you, and the Conservation Project, which works intensively in capacity building and conservation of the brilliant artworks in the museum's collection. The exhibition is organized on the occasion of 75 years of Indian independence, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. So it, of course, is a very special moment for India to have encouraged this, for the government to have endorsed this, and for the public, you, to have enjoyed this. So now we can, of course, begin our panel. So this was no small feat. We had many co-curators come help us. We've had the brilliant opportunity to have some of our co-curators here with us today. But I would also like to acknowledge the curators that couldn't be with us today. So may I begin with introducing Jyoti Roy, the project's lead curator from the CSMVS. Nilanjana Som, our voice of reason and also a curator on the project. Oh, we are thrilled to have you here, Professor Dr. Andrea Scholl, the project lead at the Staatliche Museen, Berlin, and its director, and of course, a man magnificent, and Dr. Thorsten Opper. He's the senior curator at the British Museum, and he's been championing this for us for many years. We've bothered him so much, so thank you so much for being on board. Dr. Marcel Marie from the British Museum and Dr. Paul Collins from the British Museum also deserve mention for their generosity in sharing their knowledge. Dr. David Saunders from the Getty Museum has also helped us immensely. They can't be with us here today, but of course we acknowledge their contribution. There are two other co-curators from the museum who've helped realize this project. There's Vaidehi Savnal from the CSMVS and Divya Pavathinal, also from the CSMVS. So with this, of course, I request you to please take to your mics and we can begin our little chat this evening about what is it that we've done in the rotunda of the main museum here. So the panel discussion is called Ancient Sculptures Matters. It's a conversation on the making of the exhibition. But before we can deep dive into what the show is all about, I think we need to understand a little bit about the context in which we set this exhibition, perhaps understand a little bit about the collections. Nilanjana, if you can please help us understand the CSMVS collections.
First of all, thank you everyone for coming and welcome. All of you here, you are friends of this Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. You have been very kind and generous friends. You all know that the museum last year completed 100 years. It was conceived in 1904 and opened its door to the public in 1922. So we have see 100 years of it. Today we stand 70,000 collections strong. We have many departments apart from the curatorial department, conservation department, education department. And to briefly, because all of you know the museum, you know that we have a wonderful collection of world art as well, reflecting Chinese and Japanese collection, some beautiful European paintings and decorative arts. And of course, we have our own Indian collection, which ranges from archaeological objects to textile, jewelry, and we have a significant collection of coins as well. And a lot of this is actually the people's history, the people's heirloom that you see over here. And of course, we cannot forget our beautiful natural history section, which is so popular with the publics.
Thank you, Nilanjana. Could you tell us a little bit about the periodicity or the chronology of the museum's collection?
Well, it starts from a very early age because we have archaeological collection which starts from stone tools and way up to, and we are still a collecting museum. We are still collecting textiles, heirlooms that is given to us. We have beautiful objects from the 16th century. We have collections also from, like I said, China and other places. So we have from starting of quite an early history of human to now, and we are very proud that our people of the city, people of the state keep still giving it to us, because after all we are a museum of people.
So in this context, Dr. Roper, can I request you to let us know a little bit about the British Museum collections and how that aids the show?
Thank you. Before I start, let me just say how pleased and honored we are that you invited us to participate in this fantastic project. You're great friends, and I think we're well-matched peer institutions, and this is another milestone in our journey together. The British Museum is comparable. We were founded by Act of Parliament in 1753, so the museum is a quarter millennium old, if you think about it in those terms. The collections, we say, roughly contain about 8 million objects. The oldest, about 1.8 million years old, a hand axe from Africa, and going right into the present. They span almost the entire globe. That's not yet reflected in the gallery, so we're working on rebalancing the focus a little bit so that all parts of the globe are represented appropriately. The collections are very comprehensive. The museum started as a collection of collections that were donated, bequeathed. What's fascinating for us as curators is that there's all the archive material as well. We know a lot about how objects were acquired. Many were excavated by us, and that gives deep context that's very useful and enables us to revisit our stores and continue doing exciting research. That, like your facilities here, we have a wonderful conservation facilities. We have a science department that's very active. So we try and be at the forefront and work closely between the curatorial staff, the scientists, and so on. We do lots of cooperations outside. Key wish for us is to share the collections. Not everybody can come to London. We try and lend as much as we can all over the globe. But it's much more meaningful if we can be partners in a project that is suggested, generated by friends like you, and work on things together. And we'll come back to that aspect of global co-curation, for which this is a model. And it's been a wonderful experience so far. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Roper. Professor Scholl, may we ask you to explain the complexity that is the State Museums of Berlin?
Yes. Yeah. First of all, I would also like to thank all the colleagues involved in this marvelous project, but especially our Indian friends who have extended such a heartwarming welcome to us here. The history of the Berlin State Museums is quite different from the British Museum, as we are a very late child of the Enlightenment. Our collections go back to the middle of the 17th century, so are almost 350 years old, but were institutionalized rather late in 1830. I'm not going into all the historical details. But from 1830 onwards, the collection was developed in a very systematic way, and from its very beginning, the museum was designed on one side as a public showcase, as a museum, but also as a research institute cooperating with Berlin University and now with the three universities we have in Berlin. So this double-sided feature is very much part of our DNA, and most of the colleagues are cooperating, teaching in universities. In the beginnings, the material came from Germany, actually, from the Roman Rhineland, for example. But already in 1698, a major Roman art collection was acquired and became the core of the collection. And then we were lucky that in the middle of the 18th century, the most powerful and perhaps also most intellectually ambitious Prussian king, Frederick the Great, he was a very educated man. He could read Latin, even ancient Greeks, spoke fluently French, brought Voltaire to his court, and he had a very personal interest in classical antiquities. He acquired marvelous single pieces like the famous Green Caesar, for example, but also entire collections, but just for his private enjoyment, and only the court could see it. So it lasted until 1830, as I said, that the collection was made public in what is now called the Altes Museum, which is the propylon, the entrance gate to the museum island. And our collection was the first collection to be displayed there together with our world-famous collection of classical master paintings. And then since 1830, the collections were extended dramatically, especially after the foundation of the German Reich in 1871, when the new Reich and its first emperor saw themselves in competition with all the major powers in Europe, especially, of course, Great Britain, already having the British Museum, France already having the Louvre, and the Hermitage already existing in St. Petersburg, and they tried to, literally compete by buying antiquities, but soon also by excavating. But this, the most famous site excavated clearly is Pergamon in Asia Minor, Hellenistic city. But this is a very short phase which effectively ends before the First World War, when the Mediterranean countries changed their legislation. This is, in very brief, how the collection came into existence. It had then an extremely unhappy history in the context of European history of the 20th century. As you all know, First World War, the dramatic economic situation between the two wars, Second World War, destruction of large parts of Europe, also of Berlin, German separation, and only since the very lucky reunification of Germany, we have been able to reunite the collections, display them, restore them, and getting them published. And part of our mission is that we, I think, very liberally lend things from our rich collections all over the world. But I think we will later on talk what makes our project so unique, and it is unique in many senses.
Thank you, Dr. Scholl. Now that we understand the context of where these objects come from, Jyoti, can you help us understand why they're here? Why these objects?
Thank you, Renuka, for that question. Of course, it's a long answer question, so I'm going to prepare you for that. I think when we all started to think about this project, we made three very simple decisions, which were not very simple to make. The first was that we wanted to reintroduce the ancient world into the vocabulary of young people in Mumbai and in India. And how to do that? We wanted to do that by showing art from the ancient world. But there can be different kinds of art from the ancient world that can be presented. How do we present something that people will remember? because this is a much larger project. This is just the first phase and the first exhibition. And at that point, we made the third most important decision, that we are going to put objects that are big. And the best choice for those was sculptures. This was the basis of phase one, which is why the exhibition is called Ancient Sculptures, India, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome. The way we selected the objects, there were different experiences. I'm just going to share one very evocative experience. I remember some of us had traveled to Berlin, and very generously, Dr. Scholl had just opened the doors into the storage of the sculptures. And this is the first time we walked into a room full of beautiful Greek and Roman marble sculptures. Our eyes were, of course, gleaming. I remember Mr. Mukherjee looked at a sculpture and he said, "Oh, look, she's wearing a sari." And we looked at an unstitched cloth draped around a sculpture so beautifully that it almost, we almost thought that this was an Indian woman standing there in the store of the Berlin Museum. And during the course of one of these journeys, Maruk looked at a sculpture of Apollo, which is in the show here, and he was somewhere hidden at the back. But she looked at it, and given the long years of experience you have, Maruk, of looking at sculptures, she said, "Oh, that is a statement," and we got to bring it to Mumbai. At the time, of course, we were looking at more traditional representations of Greek sculpture, so we had chosen an image of Athena, which ultimately didn't come because of conservation reasons, and several others are here. And therefore, there was the opportunity to go back to the sculpture of Apollo and bring it here. So essentially, these were journeys that we made together with colleagues. And the most important thing we did was we looked at these pieces. And that was the third most important decision that we wanted to take for our audiences. We wanted the ancient world, we wanted sculptures, and we wanted to encourage young people to look at sculptures. And this became the foundation of the curatorial conversations we had. And this meant that we ourselves had to learn to look at them. And this is where the co-curatorial exercise was so successful. And we had several meetings in person, of course. And actually, we had several sessions, long conversations with Neil McGregor, talking about how to look and read a sculpture. And we've tried to reproduce that for you in the gallery. Our curatorial conversations were also very interesting because after a couple of meetings, we realized that this listening to the whole history of Greek mythology or listening to the history of Egypt, we can read all of that. But what is it that an Indian member of audience is going to feel when they stand in front of, say, a sculpture of Sekhmet? Images of all these are in the brochures that are with you. We don't have a screen here, but do flip through. And we realized that they are going to come with their experience of being Indians who look at thousands of Indian sacred sculptures. So they're going to have questions. They're going to have questions like, why are they not looking at us? Because all the Indian gods look straight at you to grant you the boon that you're asking. Or why are they so static? Many of the Egyptian sculptures are very static, and the Indian sculptures are so dynamic, almost in a dancing posture, etc. And we had, I think, one of the questions that almost threw our Greek scholars into a laughter was when we asked, why do the Greek gods wear slippers? Where do these sandals come from? None of our gods wear them. So we actually asked very, very instinctive, innocent sometimes questions to them, and they very generously gave answers to them, which helped us shape the experience for the Indian public. And to accentuate this experience all the more, I remember we had a discussion here at the CSMVS that what we should also do is provide the visual vocabulary of Indian sculptures right next to these guest sculptures. so that it allows for a very subtle conversation to happen in the present day. So when we look at the image of Dionysus, right next to an image of a bodhisattva, Gandhara bodhisattva, there are common things in the visuals of the sculptures that people will notice, but they will also be given enough information to read the differences or the diversities between these sculptures. And after doing all this exercise, I think we realized that what we were doing is co-curating, because we were providing each other our own perspectives to looking at art, and shaping the text and the interpretation that has gone into the exhibition. Each of the texts that you read in both the languages have probably undergone over 100 drafts. They are sculptures in themselves. And that was necessary because it had to be the right tonality, it had to be the right approach, and it had to accommodate everybody's concerns about how we were going to present these to our public. And I suppose that journey hasn't ended. In the next few months or weeks, if we find perspectives that will add to the knowledge that we want to share, we will keep changing the labels. I think overall it was mostly possible because of empathy, kindness, and the generosity of all the partners. Without that, co-curation is not possible. One has to be extremely flexible and detached with one's own understanding of anything if you want to learn something new. And I think that sort of happened quite naturally in this process. And here I know a lot has been said about the group of women working together, etc. But I think what the group of women have done quite naturally is agreed to disagree and move on. And that sort of aided the curatorial process.
Thank you, Jyoti. I think you've concluded it quite well. But it's interesting that you mention the process of co-curation as being so complex, because what we've also done is almost co-curated locally with our district museum in Vidisha, because in understanding our central piece that sits in the middle of the rotunda, we have found ourselves rediscovering and questioning our own understanding of Indian sculptural art. So, standing tall in the middle of the rotunda is the mighty Varaha. Nilanjana, can you help us, guide us through the Varaha a little bit?
I feel nervous now talking about the Varaha. Jyotinder ji is there, Jamkhirkar sir is here. I think without them it would have been impossible to understand, because again, we often take it obviously that we think that because we are Indians and we are presenting Indian sculpture to an Indian audience, we believe that people will naturally understand. Yes, there is a familiarity, but there's also, we understood when we got the challenge of explaining the Varaha, writing a label for it, that it was very difficult for us to make it understandable for the public. It is a beautiful 11th century piece that has come from the district museum, who have been so generous. And we have been constantly in conversation with their curators as well, trying to understand the piece, because it is a very complex sculpture. But it is also probably the perfect sculpture to take the center stage, because it represents in short or in long the whole philosophy, the whole Indian philosophy and the continuity of tradition that it is. It is in the animal form. It is the Varaha avatar of our primary deity, Lord Vishnu. And it represents the whole cosmos, where it's wearing the whole cosmos. And it's almost like they are here witnessing what we are doing, if I may say so. And it is so beautiful, narrates the tradition of art, of religion, of philosophy that has been passed on, that has been added to. And the way it was found also is very interesting. It was found only a few years ago, became part of the museum over in the Vidisha District Museum. You have the beautiful Bhudevi standing, almost clinging on to, almost holding on to the snout of the Varaha. Those who have studied Indian art history know about how in the Varaha form, Vishnu actually saved our earth, and in doing so, has helped the humankind from, getting, from falling into darkness and chaos. And these are also some of the themes that some of the other sculptures in the gallery talk about: order and chaos. So it is, I think, only right that it was it's in the center of it, and so many saints and deities and divinities, not just and earthly figures and figures from the netherworld are standing in the center, also asking you to witness what has been created, and also pointing out to our three beautifully curated sculpture galleries, which shows sculptures from the Hindu art, Buddhist, and Jain, from the CSMVS's own collection. So it was also, in a way, a very interesting collaboration, because for the first time we collaborated with the Vidisha Museum, and they were here yesterday, and they are so excited, and they themselves want to take this collaboration forward, and we hope that even in the second phase we will be able to borrow something from that museum.
Thank you, Nilanjana, for succinctly walking us through this very complex object. For those of you who have seen the exhibition, of course, you've seen the Varaha, you've met the Varaha. For those of you who haven't, there's a little brochure handout being passed around, and you can see a little image to know what we're talking about. But flanking the Varaha around all sides are magnificent images, pictures of divinity, sculptures that have come on loan. Professor Scholl, may I request you to reflect on one of the sculptural pieces that you've so kindly lent us?
Yes. One of our intentions was to show, with relatively small number of sculptures, several important aspects of what ancient sculpture actually means, and ideally bring them into conversation with your Indian collection, which has so marvelously been redisplayed in recent months, and now literally talks to the objects we have lent to you for quite a while. I would like to speak about a torso of Apollo, and one of the first irritations I have encountered here is the fact that we bring a torso. This is absolutely normal for an archaeologist to operate with fragments, and it's very interesting how the idea of the torso came into being, at least in Middle European art history. Until, I would say, the early 19th century, almost all sculptures found were restored, sometimes in rather curious ways. Before, it was not known to which type the sculpture might have belonged. It was restored fancily, and from the middle of the 19th century onwards, when archaeology had already developed to become a serious scientific discipline, it became clear that many of these Baroque or Rococo or early 19th century restorations were wrong. So we learned from that it's better to leave the torso a torso, and to explain how he might have looked like, and that's what you are doing. So this is, in very brief, the history and the attraction of the torso. The one we have sent is, I think, a very beautiful sculpture belonging to a certain type of Apollo, and it represents in our exhibition the ideal of male beauty. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of classical sculpture, because what the ancient Greeks invented in their classical age, mainly the 5th century BC, is still a relevant norm of physical beauty, not just for men, but also for women. I can't go into the details. We did a big exhibition in Brazil. Brazil, and especially Sao Paulo, is the world capital of beauty surgery. And there we learned how attracted people felt to classical sculpture. And if you look at it closely, the most interesting aspect is what looks at first as being a naturalistic reproduction of a very well-developed male body, for example, is in fact pure construction. And the way it was constructed can be reconstructed by closely looking at it. I'm not going to the details. It's about proportions. It is about forms which look anatomically correct on first view, but are constructed. If you look at the torso, how the legs are linked to the torso itself, to the body, no human being shows such forms. And that's the same case with the classical profile. If you look at 10,000 people, you will find perhaps one having a classical profile. If you look at the coiffure of Min, this is pure construction. This is what the ancient Greeks found beautiful. Not pretending that it's naturalistic, but it has been such a hit, so to say, that it's still relevant for our idea of beauty. I can't talk about India because I'm not knowledgeable what an Indian audience would regard as the perfect male or female body. But at least in the European or even in the Latin American context, this is still the case. And I think that's quite an interesting aspect.
Thank you, Professor Scholl. And I think, of course, with conversations around body positivity and conversations around what a body type means and where the perfect body comes from, it's really interesting to draw on this reference, especially because there are so many gymnasiums in Mumbai named Apollo. Dr. Roffern, can we have you speak to one of the objects?
I think I pick up on what Jyoti and Andreas said earlier. I'll talk a little bit about the statue of Dionysus Bacchus, which is on your right as you enter the rotunda. First of all, I think it's a really good and perhaps obvious choice to select sculptures. They show divine beings, mythological figures, but they're human bodies. So we can all instinctively relate to them. We can judge how we perceive them. That's a good start. As Andreas said, these images have defined the Western standard of beauty. And for that statue of Dionysus, we have reports of visitors trying to touch, even hug them, which is very much which some of the ancient sources tell us happened in the late classical period, for example, when one of the great Greek sculptors, Praxiteles, created a new image, and people wanted to commune with the image, had themselves locked into the temple to be and remain close to the image. So very powerful. There are many aspects I could point out. The statue of Dionysus is relatively complete. We talked about the contrast to torso and so on. Relatively complete. It was never restored. It gives us a good sense of what a figure like that looked like. Again, I can't praise enough the display and the design there. It looks fabulous. You can see the body, which is slightly androgynous, which is a characteristic of later depictions of Dionysus. He also had a huge female following, by the way, in terms of processions and cult practice. Women were very prominent. Has this long hair from behind. Often you don't know if it's a male or a female figure you're looking at. It's also a statue where we have a very precise context. It was found inside a temple. So it's a cult statue in a city, a Roman city in northern Africa. So that is a good way of comparing with the sculpture in the Indian sculpture galleries. And that's where many of these questions actually came out. Why doesn't he look at you? Why is the drapery slipping off? Why is he wearing sandals if he's almost nude? And that's really interesting. And there isn't an easy answer. And I'd like to come back to what Jyoti said, that sometimes you agree to disagree, but I think the basic principle of our work together was that all questions are fine. Every question will lead you to something interesting. And I think that is the basic underlying principle, and that's where we learned so much from you and things that we'll transfer back. It's quite disarming, some of the questions. When we started, we described these sculptures as we would do to our own audience, and that's assuming a certain type of knowledge and familiarity, over-familiarity perhaps even. So looking at them together with you and discussing them, thinking aloud, telling us what we notice as beautiful or strange, that is a great process, a very creative process, and I think we've all benefited enormously from it. And there was why did we choose certain sculptures? The Dionysus is a beautiful one because it has context, so we wanted to provide a range. There are two I won't dwell on them, but they're two fragments from great buildings of the ancient world that were by the ancient Greeks already counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, because they came from splendid monuments, extremely rich, I mean, grand in size, extremely rich in decoration. Often we know the name of artists who participated, and so on. The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which allow us to tell wonderful stories. But Dionysus has links to India. That's maybe an overly obvious point of reference. According to some versions of the myth, he was born in India, traveled to the Mediterranean, later went back. That made him very attractive for the kings who ruled the Greek lands and the conquests after Alexander the Great, because they saw themselves as a new Dionysus. And he's such an interesting figure. He serves so many different purposes. He's linked to wine and intoxication, but not intoxication is perhaps the wrong term. Imbibing wine releases, it liberates you, and it brings you closer to the gods. I think that's partly behind it. It's closely associated through processions and so on, initiations, to the theatre. So when Dionysus was celebrated, particularly in Athens and in Alexandria in Egypt, there were processions and there were theatrical performances. So that link is very close and offers many opportunities we can explore. Also, you can see, because there are 3 representations in the exhibition, how this art, and that's probably what sets classical art slightly apart. It's a sort of aberration, a short blip in history that's not typical globally at all. It evolves. On the beautiful vases from the Getty, you'll see an old archaic version of Dionysus, who's a very serious-looking, bearded, elderly male. And then we move on to these youngish figures, androgynous figures. And it's interesting as well, if I may hijack one of Andreas's sculptures, there's a bearded god, a fatherly figure, maybe Zeus or something similar, Jupiter. This genre stayed relatively constant from early on. In the later centuries, because they serve needs of society which are changing, or rulers, royal courts, or other parts of the population, things like Dionysus and so on evolve. And then at some point they reach what they're happy with, and that evolution stops. There are also aspects that I think one can explore and come back to. And it's something you can do, and you can bring friends and discuss. I think you can go through the same process, and it will be very rewarding. Greek art, Roman art is very modern. I mean, we sometimes are too close to it. We don't see what's special anymore. Roman art offers scalability, are the buzzwords now. Seriality, you can produce multiple copies. You can have a small-scale version for domestic use. You can scale them up. There's enormous variety. They're very flexible, which is actually quite a good thing if you think about it. You may have similar-looking youthful figures, and if you look at the Apollo and the Dionysus, you'd be, unless you do a lot of iconographic research, you'd be hard-pressed to tell who's who. But you can just exchange an attribute, and you can change it into a different deity. And of course, remember, they were all set on plinths, and they had inscriptions often. There were offerings, so there were many things that guided you through and allowed you to worship or in other ways relate to the sculptures. So already, I think I'll stop here, but already you see how many questions there are and what wonderful possibilities there are to make use of this collection. And you can group them every which way you like. You can make these comparisons between the classical sculptures, the early and late ones, and particularly, hopefully, the Indian ones. That is what's so stimulating and what we all benefited from enormously.
Thank you, Doctor. I think Dr. Thorsten has led us to a very interesting point, Jyoti, and I would like to offer you this question. So these objects are being viewed singularly, but they're also viewed in juxtaposition, and they're viewed together in pairings, in threes, in fours. What is the vocabulary we're providing for these encounters? What do you think about these pairings? What are we offering? What is this exhibition doing?
I think across the many sculptures that are on view, there are three major themes that kind of emerge. The first being the divine form and the different shapes and symbolisms that it takes in the ancient world. The second is around the idea and the ideals of beauty. Many of these became the grammar of making sculpture, even painting, in the centuries that followed. And the third, and perhaps the most important, is the connection between nature and humanity. And these themes came out of us understanding the sculptures individually. When we imagined our contemporary audiences today, we realized that a large number of young people have an opinion about religion and faith. They have sometimes very strong positions about if one should be an atheist, one should be a believer. And therefore, it was quite interesting for us to go right back into the ancient world to probe what would have made some of the early sacred sculptures. And we realized that, if we travel back into the ancient world, imagine yourself standing under the night sky, and suddenly there's a thunderstorm, and you don't know where it's coming from. You have no answers from science or technology or philosophy yet. You are just experiencing something absolutely unprecedented, something that happened during the COVID years. We experienced something absolutely unprecedented. We didn't know how to control it. We didn't know if there were answers. And there perhaps was a moment when human beings across the world would have given shape to some of the sacred imagery that they thought would control these environments for them. How does day happen? How does night happen? Why do women die while giving birth? And these were some of the first motivations that created some of the sacred imagery across the world. And there was an inherent connection with the natural environment and the surrounding in which humanity was basically trying to survive. And it was important for us to bring this story to the young people of India because it provides a little bit of a context, even empathy, towards a much larger population in India, that a majority of Indians are believers. And to take a more well-rounded stand about co-believers and understand what faith is all about. And that's illustrated through some of these partner images that are standing next to each other. So while they do comment upon form, they do comment upon stylistic similarities, they also comment upon some philosophies. For example, I remember, Professor Jain, in one of the conversations we had with you, he had helped us read the Bodhisattva image. He said, look, in India, the sacred sculptures evolved from many aniconic forms. There wasn't the human form in the beginning. But when there were cross influences from other parts of the world, and gradually the human form emerged in the Indian sacred, you still see reminiscences of these symbols on their bodies. So when we are comparing Dionysus, or not comparing, but when we are looking at Dionysus right next to Bodhisattva, we still have those very aniconic symbols on the body of Bodhisattva. We have the urna, we have the bump of enlightenment, we have the slightly bent knee. These are all symbols that kind of transcend from the aniconic to the iconic. Whereas in the Greek image of Dionysus, you don't see these symbols because those symbols are hidden in the perfect body of Dionysus, which also symbolizes a perfect mind. So there were different forms and grammars that the ancient world imagined in sculpting their divine. And some of those are presented here physically and some through images for us to explore and understand. I think what is also very valuable is that there are 4 films in the exhibition where we have our co-curators speaking about some of the geographical contexts, some of the cultural contexts from where these sculptures are coming. And those also provide another layer of information about the pieces that are on display. But ultimately, I think it is going to be, I think one of the great achievements for the exhibition is the amount of detail in design, particularly in lighting design, that has been provided, because it really helps you see the sculptures. And when you see them, you almost feel empowered to draw your own conclusions. And when you do that, you will obviously have questions which are of your own. And that's really the path that we have charted out for everyone to enjoy the exhibition.
Thank you, Jyoti, which I think leads us directly to probe a little bit further, Professor Scholl. What is the Greek world telling us? What do you think has been the Greek way of representing the divine, and what was the relationship of a Greek citizen with their gods? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you. I would like to take up your metaphor of the grammar. Of course, there is a grammar behind the representation in Greek sculpture. In many cases, we can clearly define the function of different sculptures. You mentioned the cult statues. We know of very, very few original pieces, but we know of many copies, so that we have a clear idea how the cult statue looked like. We also have a relatively clear idea how these cult statues were venerated. We can reconstruct large parts of the rituals. But Greek sculpture played a major role in other contexts as well. Votives regularly took the form of sculpture in all imaginable sizes, from tiny terracottas to monumental, high-quality hollow cast bronzes, for example, in which the Greeks really excelled. But you could also erect a statue on your tomb or that of your family. So there are various functions these sculptures had. And the Greeks, they, in the context at least of European art, invented the image of the human being in the form of sculpture. They started pretty early with that, already in the geometric period, in a small format, just in terracotta and bronze. And then clearly under the impact of the Egyptian sculptures they had seen in the 7th century, they experimented with large sculptures, monumental formats. They were overambitious. By working in marble, they realized that their statues were so large that they immediately cracked and fell down when they were first erected. Then they found out that a size between 2 or 3 meters was right, and then they stopped experimenting but producing sculptures in great quantity, and very often in great quality. Sculpture also had a very important feature which we have not mentioned yet, and that is polychromy. Almost all marble sculptures were painted, brightly painted, as we know by now, and also the bronze sculptures were polychrome by using silver, copper, or other metals to contrast with the bronze surface. That was actually the focus of our subject, a main focus in the last 2 decades, because new scientific methods allow to reconstruct polychromy in great detail. And one of the questions we discussed today is what we know about polychromy in Indian sculpture. I simply by experience, I would guess that they can't have been just stone color, but you will tell me. So this is just a very rough sketch of in which contexts Greek sculptures were used.
We'll just open up the questions to the audience shortly, but if we can take the last 2 questions with you. Dr. Oppa, if you can tell us, why are we looking at Roman sculptures when we're speaking of Greek art?
Yes, good question. The period covered by the sculptures in the exhibition, the later Greek period and then the Roman period, is also the origin of art history as we understand it in the West. In the West, you have writers beginning to collect things, collect biographies of great artists. I mean, that whole notion of an artist who's a star gets commissioned and so on. That's the beginnings there. We have the inscriptions and so on. So there's a selection process. In parallel, we have an awful number of texts from the Greek and Roman period. Again, historically, that is quite unusual. So we know an awful lot of detail about practice, about display, about collecting. You have collectors of sculptures and so on. Their use in daily life, their contexts, who put up a statue and paid for it, and why. You know, all that information is there to be unlocked and taken in, which is fascinating. And there is then, it begins earlier, but in the Roman period in particular, an art production, an art industry, if you like. There's some very famous works that are considered the high point of development, and you can commission a copy. And again, we have amazing detail. There's some famous statues, say from Athens. The casts were made, and then marble copies were made of the casts. And as I said earlier, you can scale them up or down, you can change attributes and so on. Some are still have religious connotations, but wealthy Romans, and again we have a lot of literary detail, they commissioned them to give a certain aura to parts of their house or their vast landscape, parks, gardens, and so on. So it's very much that element of connoisseurship that comes in. But again, they're very flexible. They can be used in many different ways. And to me, focusing on that makes them attractive and modern. For us, it's unlocking their potential again. As I said, there's an element of overexposure. You have this evolution that goes on from the classical period to the late classical, early Roman, maybe say to around AD 400. And then viewing habits and needs change, and you get a wholly different type of sculpture again and representations. So that stops. And then it's rediscovered in Europe during the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical antiquity. And again, it's quite fascinating to see in their exhibitions, and it's something I would like to explore more again, even for our own audiences who are familiar with the concept, but could use perhaps a little reminder here and there, how artists in particular were fascinated when these things came out of the ground. We know that the great Renaissance masters, Michelangelo, Raphael, and so on, they were on site in Rome when some of these things were discovered, and they felt inspired straight away. They used them in their paintings as models. It was like going back to life drawing or working from life. So there are two periods of enormous impact and inspiration. But again, it's only one solution. There's a difficult heritage that obviously in Europe, this became defined as the high point of a development, and that's not true. It's one particular solution. It's been very powerful at certain moments in history, but they're equally valid different traditions. And again, by contrasting and seeing what they all bring to the table, how they enliven and empower an image, they're different ways. That's fascinating.
Thank you, Dr. Roper. And I think Dr. Roper has brought us almost to the present day, because sitting in the CSMVS collections are massive European paintings, and we encounter so many of these figures. We have a painting featuring Bacchus, Dionysus, and this really explains his presence in these paintings in the later period. Nilanjana, if you can help us understand, why have we taken on this project today? Why must we look into these ancient sculptures, our ancient past?
Apart from the fact that we are in a museum, I think as human beings, we constantly have this urge to know our past, where we are coming from. This is an answer, this is a question that that constantly bothers us, intrigues us, and we try to find an answer to. And it is also of an understanding of what is becoming of us today and what is the legacy that we are going to leave tomorrow. It is actually that thread, and we are constantly tying little knots of histories on it. And this is what exactly this exhibition is doing today, is that it is bringing some pieces of the past together in one space where people can have dialogue about about shared histories, shared connections, about our past, about who we are today, and what we are to become tomorrow. And we should feel that this is a safe space to have such dialogues and conversations instead of arguments, instead of getting into a race of who is better, whose culture is better, whose religion is better. So I think it is only very right, and at a very right moment of history, where we are again rediscovering ourselves post the pandemic, as humans, as people who have countries, nations, people who have helped each other, to look back and also think about what as human, as cultured, civilized human being it means to be. And I think it will be great if people come here not seeking answers about who we are, but rather come with many questions. And it's okay to have those questions, because that's what we are here for. That's what this exhibition, our role is to enable such questioning, is to have dialogue, because there's never going to be a perfect answer. There's never going to be, in fact, an answer. So I think it is just right that we have got such pieces of history that, as everyone pointed out here, that answer such crucial questions about human origin and human needs right now in the 21st century.
Thank you, Nilanjana, for really punctuating the purpose of the exhibition and why it was important for us to take this on today, why we continue to do the good work that we do, why we continue to work with children, the younger minds that will continue the legacy that we create of questioning, of curiosity, of ever-evolving thought. With that, I invite questions from the audience. So if anybody, oh, okay, a hand promptly raised there. Please. May we please have a mic?
Guten Abend. Ich hatte eine Frage an Professor Dr. Andreas Scholl. Hallo, es war mir eine Freude, Sie zu hören. Mein Name ist Sharon. Ich arbeite ehrenamtlich bei der Asiatic Society of Mumbai und besuche den A1-Durchkurs bei Goethe Institute. So, sorry for any mistakes. I'm so glad you brought up the universities and the student participation and the sort of outreach efforts that you're making for students in Berlin. I would like to know that if somebody wanted to work with your organization, or if somebody was a student who's learning museum sciences or history, how do they sort of get more involved, let's put it that way? Like, what are your colleagues looking for when they sort of ask students to get more involved with things? So this is my question purely from an academic point of view. Thank you. Vielen Dank.
Yes, many thanks for your answer and compliments for your German. Yeah, we integrate students on several levels. So we offer internships for classical archaeologists on a 4 weeks basis. We always have also people being trained in conservation as interns. So I'm on the job now for more than 20 years, and I've seen hundreds of interns working for us. There are very strict regulations to exclude exploitation, of course, of unpaid work. But on a very regular basis, we have interns, and I think they learn a lot within 4 weeks by simply seeing what we are doing. For persons who have finished their university studies and have taken a PhD, we offer a 2 years course, and these colleagues are treated as colleagues from the very first beginning, and after 2 years they, I think, know exactly what curatorship is about. Just a brief answer, but perhaps afterwards we can speak about details.
Thank you, Professor Scholl. That was a very specific question. If we can have some more questions about perhaps the exhibition, the Mediterranean. Do we have any curious audience questions? Oh, please.
Jyoti, you mentioned, you gave an example of a person in the ancient world confronting a thunderstorm before we had science or technology or philosophy. And part of the point of this entire exhibition is the connections between ancient Indian sculpture, much of which persists today. I mean, we worship many of the same gods, and practices of worship in ancient Rome or ancient Greece. And what I was wondering is whether it makes sense for a visitor, for someone like me, when I'm approaching this stuff, to try and understand ancient Rome or ancient Greece through the 21st century practice of Hindu worship, because unlike your imaginary man, we do have the meteorological department, we have public health officials, we have quantum scientists and so on, while still having our Hindu beliefs. Question mark.
Thank you, Leo, for that question. And we grappled with this question as well, because there is a lot of active worship, a lot of active ritual that is imbibed within the contemporary Indian communities. A lot of that is sometimes by habit, sometimes it is as part of celebration, sometimes it is ritual related to stages of life, etc., etc. And today I think it is part of the fabric of Indian culture. And this continuity is something that we are talking about in our Indian sculpture gallery in the museum, where you do find objects that date from the ancient times until the contemporary times. And even now, the CSMVS collects a large number of traditional art from different parts of India, where the traditional motif is used, but they're often commenting on contemporary issues. There are Gond paintings, for instance, or there are Varli paintings, etc. So one of the questions that we did ask to our co-curators was that, yes, exactly this. An Indian member of the audience will want to know how the Greek sculptures were worshipped, for instance. What was the relationship between a civilian and their god at that time? The peculiarity being, of course, that none of these Greek and Roman gods are worshipped any longer in the way they were worshipped earlier. So we have recognized that in India, the context is entirely different, and there is a continuity of practice. I do recognize what you're saying, that today knowledge has added from different disciplines into how we look at the world. We continue to still revere and, whoever is faithful does sort of continue their practice of religion. And interestingly, in India, it is a personal choice. And it's quite evident in many of the Hindu sculptures that you are almost given the choice of having a personal connection with your God, which sometimes we were confused about, and we didn't know if it existed, say, in ancient Greece or in ancient Egypt, where it was sometimes it was more like a civic activity. But here, each person is allowed to have a personal relationship with their God, pray to them, ask for boons, that sort of goes on. So the relationship between a faithful and their God is quite different in different cultures. And in India, it's taken a different shape, whereas in other parts of the world, it has different shapes and forms. So we recognize that there are diversities of how people respond to sacred imagery, and that both the idea of what we think is logic at this point, given the information and knowledge we have about the world, and pure faith, which is often not related with logic, can coexist. And that, I think, is the complexity that we're all dealing with for many, many thousands of years.
Thank you, Jyoti, for that response. Do we have any other questions? At the back.
Hello, I'm Ruchira Sarma. I just had this curious thought. This exhibition focuses on Egypt, India, Assyria, Greece, and Rome. But if you look at the larger context of the world, there are so many ancient civilizations and cultures. So I'm just curious how the curatorial team decided upon these specific sort of cultures to represent. were there other sort of cultures that the team was interested in exploring, and what sort of inhibited the team to explore those? Just curious about that. Thank you for the discussion. It was very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Nilanjana, may I direct this question at you?
First of all, thank you for the question, because that brings me to the point that there is going to be a second phase of the exhibition where we will be exploring obviously other cultures. And here, like Jyoti initially said, the idea was to get larger sculptures and talk about few points through them. It was not to miss out any other sculptures or not, but also there are, because we are discussing museological challenges and decisions that we took. So we thought for this exhibition, which is actually kind of a showstopper, it's actually forerunner to the larger exhibition. So we thought for now we will limit ourselves to this first few civilization, and then generate enough curiosity for you to come and look at the larger exhibition that is going to come early in 2025. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Nilanjana. You've just announced an exciting, an exciting new project for all of us. What Nilanjana is alluding to is a gallery on the ancient world, its civilizations and cultures, which is cooking right now. And soon enough, we'll be able to share more details with you. But yeah, it's exciting work. Do we have any more questions? Okay. We can, yeah. Maybe these can be the last two questions. Ma'am, please.
Good evening, this is Aditi. I was curious to know what are the similarities or dissimilarities that the panel found interesting between the Indian sculptures and the ancient sculptures that we saw in the museum today.
Thank you. Professor Scholl.
Yeah, thank you for this question. In our discussion, we haven't mentioned all the sculptures you can see in the rotunda. One which shares a clear feature with Indian sculpture is the Triton, not mentioned already. Already the Greeks were very fond of combining human features with those of animals. And this seems to me, as someone who's not knowledgeable about Indian sculpture, quite prominent feature in what I see in your Indian gallery. And it's not just the combination of animal and anthropomorphic features, it's also something which you have mentioned, Jyoti, it's iconic objects. So the Greeks were extremely open as far as importing ideas or prototypes from neighboring cultures is concerned. And that makes Greek religion extremely interesting and attractive. It's an open system. There's no dogma. If you need a new god, you import one. You can rise a hero to the status of a god. There are famous examples when the Greeks in the late 5th century had massive problems with a plague. They imported the totally unimportant hero Asclepius to Athens, and within decades he became one of the most venerated gods in the Greek pantheon, because people clearly believed that he would help them to overcome a plague. So there are not just superficial features like combining animal and anthropomorphic forms. I think there are deeper links between the images, and I think that's no wonder. We know of all the trade contacts between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East and India from early on. We know that in Hellenistic times the ties became even closer. Lots of details we could mention here. So it's not just coincidental what we see. There were clearly influences going both ways.
Dr. Scholl has explained, we have two pairings in the exhibition. One is between an Egyptian god, Hapi, who is the god of the inundation of Nile, and the other is Ganga, the holy river Ganga. And the way they sort of talk to each other is, of course, we realize that water is crucial to ancient civilizations, and there are personifications of gods and goddesses in both cultures that signify the importance of water. But that significance is slightly varied. For instance, Hapi is, because he is the god of the inundation of Nile, the flooding of the Nile was essential for the survival of the Egyptian people. They created an image of a sacred sculpture that was an offering to actually the main god, the sun god, Amun-Ra, for signifying the, making sure that the Nile flooded every year and there were crops and there was produce and so on. In case of Ganga, it's different because here the significance is not related to flood. It's related to the purification of the soul when you die so that you can have your rebirth as a pure person. So water is common in both situations, but the imagery and the reason why water is important is quite diverse and different. Similarly, when we look at the pairing of Sekhmet and Narasimhi, Narasimhi from the Indian pantheon and Sekhmet again from the Egyptian world, Sekhmet is a wrathful goddess meant to protect the people and particularly the king in Egypt. And she's also the goddess for protecting people from epidemics, etc. And offerings are made to her. And here you have Narasimhi. Both have the same lion head. And they are kind of combination of human-animal forms. But there are, again, subtle differences. If you look at the images when you go into the gallery, you'll see that Narasimhi is in a very dynamic dancing posture, whereas Sekhmet is not. She's standing very static. And this, we were struck by it. So we asked our curators in the British Museum that why is this? Why is she, she's angry, so she should look angry, but she doesn't look angry. And the reason that was explained to us was that because the Egyptians had such a desire for permanence, and their entire philosophy around afterlife was based around it, that they created sculptures that looked very static. So while she has her function of being angry and being protecting, etc., but her image is very static and calm. Whereas in our case, in Narasimhi, she has a very angry, expressive face, eyes almost popping out with fangs, etc. And that's how she expresses anger. So there might be visual similarities, but there are often very subtle differences in mainly the way that people from these ancient cultures imagine their life. We were also struck, for instance, by how the ancient cultures perceive time and lifespan. Some cultures believe that you are born and you're dead, and that's it. You go to the underworld. Whereas in India, what we imagined was that it's cyclical, and you will be born again and you will die, and what you must strive to do is escape the cycle of life and birth. And therefore, our gods were performing certain functions, etc. So like this, of course, there are many of these pairings that have these subtle differences and similarities. For more simpler, vision, you can almost make a constellation of all the lion heads in the exhibition. You have the lion head, you have Sekhmet, you have Narasimhi, you also have small lions in the sarcophagus. So there are many repeating patterns that you will come across in the show.
Thank you, Jyoti. We'll take Dr. Manjari Kamath, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so that was a very stimulating exposition. I just have one question for Jyoti. You mentioned about the personal connection, in the Indian traditions with the god. But I wonder whether in this exhibition, you're also going to go into the complexities of Indian society in which it was not possible for certain sections of society to have that personal connection, and there was the caste system, and so are you also going to go into those complexities? Because I think we also have to guard against looking at a homogenized view of this as an Indian tradition. So I wonder whether you will be going into the depth and looking at that, and then how the Buddhist tradition and other things come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manjriji, for asking that question. I think one of the things that this exhibition is going to do is to allow people to ask whatever kind of questions they want to ask. And there will be no one answer. And we do hope that in the academic program, we will have an opportunity to address some of these through conversation, because some of these ideas are best discussed in conversation and understood better rather than just one visual statement or one text. But having said that, we were actually quite surprised to find that the image of Dionysus, for instance, was placed in a temple, and correct me if I'm wrong, where not everybody was allowed to go in. And it was very interesting to see that similar complex societies or similar challenges existed in other parts of the world as well. And we were quite interested to understand what were the reasons for that, and how did early Greek society, for instance, deal with it, etc. So we definitely have many opportunities where some of these questions will be raised. There will be attempts to find explanations, more than find explanations, share opinions and understandings. Certainly, there is no attempt of oversimplifying anything in the exhibition, simply because A, it is on for a long durée. It is here for 10 months, which will again allow for many opportunities for guided tours, question-answer sessions, and explanations that can be provided, and they will be encouraged through most of our platforms. And more importantly, the Indian Sculpture Gallery and rest of the galleries in the museum, I think, provide a wide window into the complex landscape, cultural, religious landscape that India is. And perhaps as an extension of this gallery, we should also enable such critical conversations around those collections in the coming times. But thank you for bringing that up. It's essential, obviously, for young people to understand that this is there.
Thank you. I think we'll take a last question from Arun Das. Arun Das is also the designer of the gorgeous show that you see. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you. I have a question which takes off from what Leo said earlier regarding the spatial dimension of what he raised. I think we live with a notional sensibility when we present a divine image in a museum space, which is primarily meant for educative outreach. My question to the panel, particularly to the visiting curators, is when you see the exhibition having manifested in the rotunda as it has, does it resonate with what you imagine the maiden spatial protocol that may have been to present some of these images in ancient Greece, in Rome, even in Egypt? And those are the mysterious bits, because in our practice of museum design, we are often weighed under, in fact, our, when we work with the homies, as it were, there is a certain veneration because we live with this habitual sense of regard and veneration for these ancient sculptures. And we don't really know how these sculptures may have been presented and what the public protocol might have been within the spaces where they may have inhabited. Was it indeed a temple? Was it a room? Was it a public square? Was there a barricaded space? And so on. So this is purely a spatial design related, if you like, question. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Dr. Roper, may I request you to take this question? And of course, Dr. Scholl can add to this.
Thank you. There are obviously many different ancient contexts, but to us as Westerners, we walk into the rotunda and we see a familiar space with these images. I mean, I felt immediately reminded, and that's part of the architectural history of the building, perhaps, of the Pantheon in Rome, the temple to all the gods, the best preserved building from Roman antiquity that was early on converted into a Christian church. Round footprint, huge dome, and it had sculptures of all the gods, or the main gods, exactly positioned as we have the sculptures in the rotunda. There are different display options that were chosen in antiquity, but this is great because it gives you a sense of the quality of the space. I mean, in Rome, I mean, I'm digressing slightly, but the dome of the Pantheon has an oculus. So on certain days of the year, a beam of sunlight will fall onto a particular statue of a god. And it can be the feast day or something like that. So, you know, you have all these associations. And there's, again, in the program, there are aspects we can tease out. And that's just one example. As I say, there are alternatives. The Dionysus would have been displayed differently. But generally, it resonates. And because there's space, you can circumambulate, you know, the statues. You can the height on the bases is, in my opinion, is just right. So it's a really good evocation of some types of ancient setting. And since you were involved, congratulations to your input there.
Yeah, perhaps just a last remark to what you're answering. Actually, the rotunda of our Altes Museum, which I mentioned, opened in 1830 to display the sculptures, quotes the Pantheon directly. It's a downsized copy of the Roman Pantheon to present exclusively the gods on the main floor. We, archaeologists and museum people, display the Greek and Roman gods as relics of a religion which does not exist anymore. I guess this is less problematic than presenting sculptures which are still directly related to religions practiced still in India. And I think this raises a lot of questions which we did not tackle in our discussion. I'm not competent to answer that, but what I remember is that we regularly had requests to our colleagues from the Ethnological Museum that people of Hindu or other beliefs wanted to venerate the pieces in the collection. And then you come into a discussion which is not a very easy one, but perhaps that's a topic which would lead us too far away from what we have been discussing here.
Just to add, I mean, I think we are quite aware that we are a museum, and it is good to build context and take it all the way up to how it would have been in the original setting. But I think we also have to allow for the space to enable critical interrogation of the pieces from an academic perspective, from a contemporary perspective. So the idea, this is my personal opinion, should not always be to emulate exactly what the context was, because the context is different. It's not a temple. It's not, a religious place. Secondly, I think a more familiar, I mean, we have many, many sculptures of Indian gods and goddesses in our museum, and invariably a family will walk in and they will touch the feet of the god. They will revere it. And we are aware of that. We will never stop that, because that's how they naturally relate to the objects. But for the academically informed, I think it's quite clear that an Indian sculpture that is broken should never be venerated. So there are many, many contexts that we have to balance and navigate through to maintain that thin line between what is a temple and what is a museum. A museum allows people of all faiths, from all backgrounds, to come and relate with the object from their perspectives, and there a certain level of neutrality is almost essential to present, which I suppose we do in our spaces.
Thank you, Jyoti. And I think the full scope of the project will only be explored over the next 10 months. But I think we've had the privilege of your time here, Dr. Thorsten Opper, Professor Andrea Scholl, Nilanjana Som, Jyoti Roy. Let's give them a round of applause, please.
Sorry, I have to thank Renuka, because Renuka is one of the sharpest curatorial minds that at least this museum has discovered. Simply because she comes from the difficult background of literature, and so she keeps challenging us with all kinds of difficult questions, which we often have no background of. But it has been absolutely charming company to work with you, Renuka.
Thank you. And of course, as a token of appreciation, as always in CSMVS style, we have a little bit something for you. Professor Scholl, Jyoti, may I request you to please offer a little gift, goodie bag, to Professor Scholl. Thank you. Nilanjana, can I request you to offer a little token of appreciation to Dr. Upper? And I must mention here the brains and the heart that led the project and put it together right since inception. We have Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, Neil McGregor, and Maruk Tarapur to thank. We're so grateful to be in their company and under their mentorship. We also have Professor Dr. Herman Patzinger join us here from the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Joan Weinstein from the Getty Foundation here. These minds have truly led us into this journey, and I hope you'll join us for it. Come back and see the show with your families, with your friends. There's lots more cooking at CSMVS. Thank you so much for this wonderful evening.